The C-SPAN networks bring you long-form public affairs programming from the nation's capital and are a public service of your television provider. C-SPAN, created by cable.
And we want to introduce you to Robert McChesney. He's a communications professor at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He's also a co-founder of the group Free Press. He served as president of that group for several years. He's currently on the board. Professor McChesney is also an author, and here is his most recent book. It's called Digital Disconnect: How Capitalism is Turning the Internet Against Democracy. Professor McChesney, what's your thesis in Digital Disconnect?
My thesis is that the internet began with extraordinary promise for democratizing society, making the world a far better place, and that some of the promises come true, but much of it has been turned on its head, largely due to commercial pressures that have changed the course of the internet dramatically, and that unless we arrest those pressures and redirect the internet, the future is not necessarily going to be as glorious as we once thought it would be.
In your book, you talk about the need to look at the internet through political economy. What do you mean?
I think that the problem we have when we study the internet, and most of the books that were written about it, many of which are outstanding, and I quote a lot of them and use a lot of them in my research, downplay the importance of capitalism and the relationship of capitalism to democracy. They put technology as sort of having a superpower over society. I think we need to sort of bring it back in and look at the classical relationship of capitalism and democracy and see how the internet fits into that to get a sense of how the internet has developed and where it's going. And that's what I mean by political economic analysis.
Professor, when you give some examples of how you think it's turned away from democracy.
Well, if you look at the beginning of the internet, Mark Andreessen, the founder of Netscape, who's one of the entrepreneurs now who invest in internet companies, said that when the internet began, when he was working on it into the early 90s, it was a militantly egalitarian and cooperative environment. By all accounts, it was seen as a great equalizer for democracy. It was going to give information equality for all people. It was going to slay tyrannical governments and large monopolistic corporations and produce a much more competitive, localized economy, decentralized economy. And in general, it was going to be make it such that self-government, which had never been fully practical prior to the internet, could actually become practical. People would actually have the information required to govern their own lives in a social sense and really fully participate. So that's the high bar of the internet when it began. And I think oftentimes still to this day, one of the points I just made, people invoke and say, yes, that's what the internet's doing. What I would argue is that on certain key points in that mythology or that dream that began the internet, what's happened is there are specific places where we've turned in the opposite direction. I'll give a couple of examples. One of the great ideas of the internet initially was that it was going to be an anonymous medium. You could go on and you could not be known who you were, so you didn't have to worry about being monitored or necessarily what you said or people keeping tabs on you. The way the internet has developed purely for commercial reasons, because this is the way commercial interests can make money off the internet. We now have gone to the exact opposite. Everything we do online is known by commercial vendors and the government to the extent it wants to know it. We have no privacy at all. Privacy, as we've understood it traditionally, has been completely decimated. So right there we have a basic difference from what the vision was 20 years ago and what it is today.
You also talk about loneliness and personalization on the internet of today.
Well, I think, in the first chapter I talk about, there's the celebrants who extol the virtues of the internet and the great things it's doing in terms of giving people power and information resources and the ability to collaborate. And then there are the skeptics, the people who are concerned that the internet is undermining the quality of our lives. And one of the arguments of the skeptics is that rather than really drawing us together, the evidence suggests that the internet is producing a lot of people who are lonelier than they were before. They have fewer friends. The more time we spend immersed in social media, the more times we spend immersed with our smartphone or our computer or our tablet, is less time we actually engage with other human beings. So it's one of the great debates. And I think it's an important debate, but I want to add again, Peter, that my view is that leaving it at that level is just parlor chit-chat. It doesn't really get anywhere. I think if we really want to take this debate to somewhere where we can affect it and understand it, we've got to put it in the sort of policy, political economy realm. Because even if you think the internet is having those effects upon people, which it may. I mean, I'm not here to pass judgment on that. I didn't do the research. But even if you do, then what do you do about it? You have to explain, why does that take place in the first place? What's driving it? And what can we do to minimize those effects to the extent we can?
Robert McChesney, you spend quite a bit of time in Digital Disconnect talking about journalism and the internet, and you have a proposal in this book. What is that proposal, and why do you spend so much time on journalism?
I confess I have a passion for journalism. I've written about it a lot. And my passion for journalism is largely my passion for democracy. And I think that all democratic theory is predicated on the idea that you have to have a healthy, vibrant journalism for there to be effective self-government. It's impossible to have a genuine notion of self-government and the liberties that come with it without a credible journalism. In the United States today, and for the last 20 years, we've seen a dramatic decline in the resources going to journalism per capita. It's been a sharp decline, and I think it's an existential problem for self-government in this country. Oftentimes people blame the internet for the dilemma when they say Craigslist took away the advertising that supported newspapers and that forced them to lay off reporters, or they say young people no longer go to traditional media, they go directly online, so there's no money therefore for traditional news media to pay reporters. There's an element of truth to that, but I think the research shows, Peter, that the decline of resources going to journalism and commercial news media began on a per capita basis back in the 80s and was in full swing during the 1990s before the internet had any perceptible effect upon news media business models. And what the internet did is basically accelerate the process and make it permanent. And the reason it did this is something that only now I think is fully being understood by people in the news media industry, and they're coming to terms with it, which is when we look at journalism, we've often thought of it as something that was a very commercially vibrant, healthy enterprise, that entrepreneurs, businesses investing in it could make money, and the competition between them would produce the best possible journalism. We'd live happily ever after. We can now see that that notion of journalism was flawed. It was wrong. The fact that we had advertising support for the last 125 years for journalism gave it the illusion of being commercially viable. The fact of the matter, though, is that final readers, final users of journalism have never provided enough money to make it a solvent market. It depended on advertising, which only used journalism opportunistically for 100 years to pay for most of the bills. And before advertising rose up, my research has shown, and others have demonstrated as well, for the first 100 years of American history, much of our journalism was subsidized by massive government postal and printing subsidies. So the truth is that journalism is a public good. The market cannot provide it in sufficient quality or quantity. To the extent that the advertising provided the money to give us a healthy journalism, those days are now gone. And they're gone for one of the points I make in the book and develop that is really crucial, which is simply this. The traditional notion of advertising, where an advertiser buys an ad on a magazine or in a TV show, or they buy an ad even on a website, and then some of the money that pays for the ad goes to pay for the content on the site. That's the deal. That's gone the way of the dodo bird. That's not happening anymore. The way advertising works online and the way it's going to be working everywhere in short order is that an advertiser says they want a demographic group. They want women 18 to 24. They want 30 million hits. And then the advertising network online will find those 30 million women wherever website they're at. And the actual website that produces the content gets only a smidgen of the money. 10 years ago, newspapers got 100% of the revenues of the ads that appear on their website as a rule. Today, they're maybe getting 5, 10, 15%, if that, depending on the network and the relationship they have. There's just not money in it. And advertisers couldn't care less if they go to a newspaper website or the Best Buy website, as long as they hit their specific target audience. As a result, the business model is dead online. And one of the tragic things that's going on in our society today is seeing wonderful journalists just desperate to figure out a way so they can pay their bills, so they can hire young kids to work with them, so they can do good journalism again as newsroom after newsroom is shrinking down or closing. And I think the evidence is in. That's never going to happen. There isn't going to be a commercial model. There's no reason we should expect there to be a commercial model. So what I propose in the book is a model that was developed first by an economist you're probably familiar with named Dean Baker, who's based in Washington. He's done a lot of great work over the years on Social Security, on the housing bubble. And Dean came up with this idea 15 years ago originally, and I've embellished it. Basically, every American would be allowed to donate $200 of government money to any nonprofit and non-commercial medium of their choice. It would be purely a voucher they would use. So it'd be a massive public subsidy of media, nonprofit and non-commercial media, so it wouldn't compete with commercial media. But the government would have no control over who got the money. It'd be purely up to individuals how they wanted to dedicate their $200. And this would mean that all those websites right now that are just absolutely struggling, if they could convince 2,000 people in their community to give them their $200, well, suddenly 2,000 people, that generates $400,000. Well, you can actually have a heck of a good product in a neighborhood of a community with $400,000. If you do a great job the next year, you might have 10 times that much. So you produce great competition. You have no government control. You have a massive public subsidy. So we can, again, have people make a living doing journalism in competing newsrooms. The only condition really that I would put on this, I wouldn't have much government oversight. Aside from having to be nonprofit and non-commercial, everything that would be produced as a result of this subsidy would have to be put online immediately, not protected by copyright, put in the public domain, and anyone can use it. The public would not be subsidizing private profits, they'd be subsidizing a public good.
Robert McChesney, there are a couple of for-profits that are now having paywalls, well-known Wall Street Journal, New York Times. If people want to read the product, is it not fair that they should pay for it?
Well, the logic makes sense, but as a scholar, my job, I'm not a shareholder in the Wall Street Journal. I'm a scholar concerned with democracy and journalism, and I think one of the striking things about paywalls came during the explosion in Boston at the Marathon a couple of weeks ago. The Boston Globe, owned by the New York Times, withdrew its paywall temporarily immediately after the explosion, saying this information is so important, we aren't going to keep anyone from getting it. And I think that's how information is in a free society in journalism. I think we should be encouraging its distribution, not putting up walls and saying you've got to pay to get inside. I think it's fine for companies to do paywalls if they want and they can find customers, and it looks like possibly some of the business press will be able to do that. The Wall Street Journal or elite press, the New York Times, might be able to pull it off. But so far, there's absolutely no evidence that it's going to be a credible model to support vibrant journalism for the rest of us. And or anything close to the type of journalism in terms of the resources and the number of people working that we were accustomed to 10 or 20, 30 years ago. There's nothing in the paywall system that's going to bring that back. At best, it's going to stop the bleeding for some elite outlets.
Robert McChesney, are people going to more personalized journalism, going to views they agree with rather than looking at a more broad spectrum?
I don't go into that in detail in the book. It's not really central to what I'm concerned with in the book. And I think there's some evidence that people do that. But what I would argue in the book, part of the reason we see that taking place is that there's such little original journalism left, so much less than there used to be, that you might as well go get some opinion with your journalism since you aren't getting any news. What I mean by that is people look at, say, for example, Fox News, and they're not the only one, but they're the one that jumps out when you talk about partisan journalism today. And they think that the great advance of Fox News was that it brought a more explicitly partisan tone to the news, that it's a pretty reliable indicator of what the Republican Party is thinking on an issue, or at least leading elements of the Republican Party if you go to Fox News. And they think that's what it brought to the product. In fact, I would argue that in terms of economics, what Fox News did quite brilliantly is it realized if you don't have any journalism, if you don't have any reporters covering anything, then if you're going to have a news channel without the resources to actually generate journalism, you ought to have something entertainment. You ought to have something provocative, something that will draw attention to you, that will create a market. And being a partisan news medium is exactly a substitution for doing real journalism. And I think MSNBC, which has sort of now found the liberal niche of sorts, follows the same pattern. I mean, once you'd stop covering things and actually having reporters do much work, it's a logical place to go, so you have some value added. But for society, having a handful of cable television networks giving their opinions on a handful of issues every day is no substitute for having people actually covering stuff. And that's I don't want to beat a dead horse here, Peter, but this is really crucial. The amount of resources covering Capitol Hill, covering the agencies of the federal government, covering state government, city government, have absolutely plummeted in the last 15 years. Much of what goes on in public life and the relationship of government and government legislative bodies and private commercial interests that used to be covered or make it into the news a generation ago no longer gets covered today. And that's the great crisis we face.
Robert McChesney, in Digital Connect, you talk about the difference between PR professionals and journalists and how that has spread.
Well, you know, public relations is a field that blossomed in the 20th century in the United States, and it's one of our great gifts to the rest of the world. And it began, its job is basically to try, it works at two levels. One is part of lobbying to help firms or private interests, whoever hires the public relations people, to get their way with legislators and government. And insofar as that happens, it's important to massage public opinion so it will not be hostile to the company or whoever's using the public relations. And it plays a very important role in sort of, a key part of what it does, is a better way to put it, is that it tries to influence the news media coverage of the issues that are important to the firm or the corporation that does the public relations, so that it is not hostile and ideally is very favorable. And so there's always been a body of people for the last 100 years whose job was to influence the news surreptitiously, so the reader would never know it, or the viewer, to get a story in there that will be favorable to the client. Now, in 1960, there was one public relations person basically for every working journalist. Actually, it's more like 3/4 of a public relation person for every working journalist. By 2010, the relationship was 4 PR people to each working journalist. And we've seen a sharp decrease in the number of working journalists in the last 3 years, and no decrease in PR people to my knowledge. So I suspect the ratio is now moving closer to 5 to 1 or 6 to 1. And what this means for us is that, you know, a lot of people say, hey, I still see news. I still turn on the TV and I've got local news and I've got cable news. I still occasionally pick up a paper and what's left of it does have news in it. What this means for news is that you'll still have stuff that's called news, but as the Pew Research has shown in its exhaustive evaluation of journalism over the last decade, increasingly what we think of as news is really unedited, unreflected upon public relations, either statements by official sources or just press releases that are run uncritically in the news media because they don't have any journalists to cover it. They're outnumbered. It's a 5 to 1 or 4 to 1 ratio. And so we think we're getting a lot of news, but in fact, to use the English language accurately, we're really getting propaganda.
One more question on journalism, Mr. McChesney, before we move on to some other topics. And what do you think of the role of the aggregators, such as the Drudge Report or Huffington Post?
I think they play a very important role. I think aggregators can be like editors. They can sift through a lot of material, so if you find an aggregator you trust, you can count on them to save you a lot of the work you would normally do. And so I think that's a very important role in a news media system, in a media system. But my concern, again, to beat my dead horse, is I want them to have something to aggregate more than just opinion pieces about PR releases.
This is the Communicators on C-SPAN. We're talking with University of Illinois professor Robert McChesney about his most recent book, Digital Disconnect. Page 168 from your book, Professor. With SOPA in 2011 and CISPA in cybersecurity in 2012, all signs point to the legislative thrust being in one direction, shrinking the rights of citizens and expanding the unaccountable prerogatives of the national security state and the internet giants.
I wrote that. That's true.
I want to go to...
If that's a true-false question, I'll say true.
No, I want you to expand on it, I guess. And also,
sure.
Why do you include the internet, what you call the internet giants, in that statement?
Oh, the internet giants are right in the middle of everything. And what I mean by the internet giants, and this is a key part of the book, a whole chapter is dedicated to this, is if you recall at the beginning of the interview, Peter, I talked about how the promise of the internet was that it was going to break down monopolistic giant corporations. The internet would make it possible for new entrepreneurs to come along to challenge them, to create much more competitive markets, to give consumers power so they wouldn't be forced to take higher prices or shoddier products from big companies. And one of the greatest ironies of the internet of all is that instead of being a force for competition, it's probably the greatest generator of monopoly in the history of economics. Everywhere you look online, what you see is that there are gigantic firms that are dominating the internet that have monopoly franchises over key parts of the internet and are making enormous amounts of money as a result. I think we're all familiar with the household names: Amazon, Apple, Google, Facebook, Microsoft, eBay. All of them have monopoly franchises. And by monopoly, I don't mean they sell 100% of everything. Pure, total monopoly. That term, those sorts of monopolies almost never, ever, ever exist, and they don't even exist. You know, John D. Rockefeller with Standard Oil did not have a monopoly in that sense. Economists mean a monopoly when you have such a large percentage of the market that you basically can control the market and control who's allowed in it and who's not in it on what terms. And when you've got over 50, 60, 70% of a market, and you're in that range, you definitely have a monopoly. And when you have over 30 or 40%, you're awfully close to it. And all the firms I just named are way above the 50, 60, 70%. Many of them are in the same range of John D. Rockefeller's monopoly with Standard Oil in the late 19th century, which I think was in the 80s, low 80s. And so we have these gigantic monopolies online that are impossible to challenge, and they become vastly profitable as a result. And to give some sense of this, 13 of the 32 largest companies in the United States in terms of market value, sort of who investors are betting on, are internet companies. 13 of the 32 largest. Sometimes it's 14, it fluctuates. Put it in comparison, there are only 3 of the too big to fail banks are among the 32 most valuable companies. And these are the banks that everyone agrees owns the government. So there are only 3 of them. There are 13 of these internet companies. All the companies I just mentioned, although Facebook's still on the outskirts, it's not yet in the top 32. But my point is, so these are enormous companies. They're monopolies, but in the economic sense, they have immense political power, and they're used to getting their way. And if they're in agreement on something, so that they agree on a specific issue, they will always get their way with our government. It's one of the reasons why monopoly is considered by democratic theory to be such an enemy of government, because it gives private economic interests such immense power over governments. No matter how well intended the governing system might be or the people might be who run it, you just can't deny that sort of economic power. That's the situation we're in. Well, these companies all make their money to varying degrees, but with Google and Facebook in the front, but all of them to a certain degree, by collecting data on people, by invading privacy. You know, they say online that if you get something for free online, you're not the customer, you're the product. And when you go online for Facebook or Google or anything where you're not forking out money, you're getting that service because basically that company is taking everything you do online that they can get their hands on, which is just more than you can believe, and using it to create a profile of you, to package you, to sell you. Well, there's one other group that's very interested in that data. That's the US government and its national security forces, its intelligence community, which has now decided, the Pentagon has created cyberspace as one of its main theaters or campaigns of war, just like a continent. You know, you've got the Asia Command, the Africa Command, the South America Command. Now we have the Internet Command. That's how they regard it. And they're dead set to get all the information they possibly can too, which is perfectly understandable. The more they know about everyone, the easier it is for them to do their job as they perceive it, protecting the United States, accomplishing their goals. Well, both of these sides have something each other wants. And so what we're seeing online is a marriage between these huge corporate giants and the military and national security part of the government, because they have a mutual interest in collecting data and sharing it if it suits both their interests. For the government, for the security people, they get a lot more data thanks to Google and Facebook and Amazon and Microsoft than they could get on their own. And for these companies, they have the US government doing their work for them. Protecting copyright abroad, protecting their franchises abroad, protecting them from hackers. And also what the US government does for these companies is it pays for much of the research and development that produced almost all these technologies in the first place. Almost all of them come out of military spending. So it's really a marriage made in heaven. Now, why that's a problem for us is going back to democratic theory. In democratic theory, it's not healthy to have monopolies that dominate the government, and it's especially not healthy to have a militarized state working with those monopolies. In fact, in almost all democratic theory, that sort of emerging relationship we have is considered antithetical to having a vibrant, healthy democracy. So that's why I raised the issue. That's why fights over issues like SOPA and CISPA are so very important.
And Robert McChesney writes in his book, Digital Disconnect, that the resulting national security complex is almost unimaginable, like trying to compute the distance from Earth to a far-off galaxy in millimeters. Over 850,000 people have top-secret clearances, some 1,300 government agencies and 2,000 private companies are collecting intelligence and have top-secret clearance. It is a massive, self-interested bureaucracy with no public accountability and barely a trace of congressional oversight. Robert McChesney, in your conclusion, one of the things you call for is heavy regulation of digital natural monopolies or conversion of them to nonprofit services. What do you mean, and how would you do that? How would you regulate some of these companies?
I think when you look at a company like Google or Amazon or Apple, most people in America, the first response when you see how monopolistic they are and how much market power they have is say, well, why can't we do to them what we did to AT&T in the 1980s, what we did to Standard Oil 100 plus years ago, and break it up into a much smaller competitive companies, and then we'll have the benefits of the market without the monopoly cost. And I think the problem with that as a solution, and why I don't think anyone takes that very seriously, is the reason these companies are monopolies is the nature of the technology. Network economics generate monopoly. So if I've got a Facebook, my choice is to go to Facebook for social media or to go to Joe Blow Book for social media, I'm going to go to Facebook because I know there are a billion other people I can communicate there. All my friends from high school who I've lost touch with. If I go to Joe Blow Book, I'll be the only person on it along with Joe Blow. It'll be a waste of my time. So everyone's going to use the number one service as a rule. There might be a second or third service that the other giants will come along with, like a Google Plus, but basically the network economics push you towards a monopoly. And if you're in a situation where you can't really get around monopoly, economists say you've got three choices. One is to do what we're doing, which is let the monopoly do whatever they want, basically, and just hope you're lucky and that nothing bad happens, but let them be unaccountable. Secondly is to do what they tried to do throughout our history and have done throughout our history, like we did with the phone monopoly with AT&T, which is to have heavy government regulation, or not heavy would be the wrong word, but strong government regulation, which would allow the monopoly to exist, but would exact terms out of the monopolist in exchange for letting them have these monopoly profits. For example, when we let AT&T have its phone monopoly, the deal was that AT&T would not discriminate against anyone. They wouldn't use different layers of pricing to make more profits, and also that AT&T would offer their phone service to everyone in the country. They'd have to go into rural areas and poor areas that wouldn't be profitable otherwise. So that's one option, try to do regulation and get something in exchange for it. I think the third option, and this is the one ironically that Milton Friedman, the great conservative economist, his mentor at the University of Chicago, suggested, and I talk about it in the book, is that once a firm gets this big, and we're talking about firms that are worth in the hundreds of billions of dollars, the only rational way with a natural monopoly is to have it be government-run, municipally run, nonprofit, non-commercial. You don't want that much commercial power over a bottleneck for the entire nervous system of your economy.
And we have been talking with University of Illinois professor Robert McChesney, one of the founders of Free Press. He currently sits on the board of that organization. Digital Disconnect is his most recent book. In 2006, David Horowitz included Robert McChesney on his list of the 101 most dangerous professors in America. Here's the cover of the book. This is The Communicators on C-SPAN.